Right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Open Dialogus. Hashtag What's Next. So, as you folks join, and I know there's always that infamous time delay between starting and people saying this. I'd like to do the introductions to the panel, two of whom I'm sure you will instantly recognise. But to start off, can I a special welcome to David Maddox. David's the political editor of the Sunday Express. David, you're very welcome to the stream.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
We have our absolute stalwarts, Rebecca Butler, who I'm sure doesn't require any introduction from me, and Bill Etheridge, similarly frequently seen on this stream, and actually will also be doing his own show, I believe, on a Thursday night. So you'll get to see plenty of Bill as 2021 progresses. So look, folks, to start off with, this wasn't actually a planned topic, but the news came in last night and broke this morning as I was listening to Julia Hartley-Brewer, in fact. And that is that I'm sure you've all seen that YouTube have chosen to take down, amazingly, the channel for talk radio. Which is an Ofcom regulated broadcaster. And I wonder, David, start with you. I mean, what was your reaction to that? What did you think?
I was surprised that somebody's biggest talk radio was taken down, to be frank. But, not surprised on the wider picture, because the big tech companies have been doing what they can to suppress debate in this area, and the interesting question is why. I mean, we've certainly experienced it at the Express. Yeah. Our website and video content we've done has sort of been downgraded on Facebook, and we've at times made a decision not to run things because we were worried about being downgraded by Facebook. There was a letter from some doctors, I think in early December, which one of the big tech companies blocked from search engines for a while. I mean, there have been many examples of people being taken off Twitter, and of course it's not just lockdown issues. I mean, famously in the US presidential election, the New York Post story got blocked by Twitter and Facebook, and there's clearly a political agenda going on with the social media companies, and it's something that really we need to monitor for the future, and we should all be worried about, really.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, what was your reaction when you heard the news?
Well, of course, David doesn't know this, but I'm one of the legal counsel of a barrister on the Free Speech Union advisory panel. Now, as I understand it, talk radio had breached previously twice, and it's a 3 times and you're out policy on YouTube. So this wasn't their first offence, as it were. As you know, David and Bill, you certainly know my personal opinion is that I believe that all speech is free unless it's criminal. But it is a private company at the end of the day. It is Ofcom regulated. And by the way, the Free Speech Union lost our case against Ofcom just at the beginning of December, where we did take them to judicial review on precisely this point. And we said that Ofcom should not be allowing or sort of enabling cancel culture on any medium at all over dissent with particularly the coronavirus discussion. I think it's because it is medical misinformation is how they posit it. That is how they've justified the suspension of talk radio on YouTube. I must say, though, that Julia Hartley-Brewer, if you're going to point the finger, Julia Hartley-Brewer she's a bit like me, she comes from a family of doctors, and I have heard her talk about lockdown, and I have heard her talk about the coronavirus debate, and I've never heard her actually propound any bizarre theories, and all she's ever said is all we want is evidence. And throw economic evidence into the mix. I've never heard her say anything that is what I would consider on the margins either. So it is worrying. It's wrong. And as a strong advocate of free speech, I find it reprehensible and worrying. Because as David said, what it does is it does affect your behavior. And I actually, something you guys don't know, I have just effectively been cancelled off Twitter, but I've self-cancelled. I've removed myself because of the behavior of certain people. And, you know, as an organization, you might think, well, do I now have to be careful what I say? And that is cancel culture by the back door. And that's what's happened. It's a shame.
Yeah, Rebecca, I mean, it's very true, everything that you say there. I think for me, Bill, that, you know, the likes of the big tech companies taking down individuals, I mean, such as myself, is you can see how they can do that, because who am I? I'm nothing. But when they start to come after, if you like, the more established media, like talk radio, for example, and further to what Rebecca and David both have said, where's it going to end? Well, I mean, who can they not take down?
It's the final piece in the jigsaw of a totalitarian takeover. I said this months ago. When you go through a situation where you're not allowed to gather, you can't protest, and, you know, whatever the view on COVID is or not, the fact that it's being used, I believe, politically in some cases, to stop people gathering to protest. You can't have a public meeting. You can't get together in a pub. The last thing that was left was social media. And I think I might have done a couple of videos and sort of blog pieces on this some months back, saying, once that goes, they've got us. How can we possibly object to anything? How can we have an alternative point of view to anything? And how can there be any kind of debate at all about the massive changes taking place in our society without having access to social media? It's impossible.
These are actually our human rights, and I have written about this before. Is you have Articles 9, 10, and 11 within ECHR, you know, which is rights to freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and freedom of association. And Bill, I've made this point before, that during a pandemic where you are doing your best to abide by the law, your freedom of association is really confined to social media. And I have felt that the worrying intrusion of organizations, I'd love to hear David's view on the campaign for countering digital hate. Imran Ahmed's group, I don't know if you know about them, but they are vociferous cancellers of absolutely everybody. Their particular focus at the moment is anti-vaxxers. And you know, I find that the way they shut people down makes it all look far more sinister, and it actually fuels conspiracy theories if the establishment is being seen to be the one to silence their own critics. You know, I'm completely with Bill on this, but I'd love to know what David thinks about organizations like CCD Hate.
Well, I mean, the whole hate crime industry, because I think it's kind of almost an industry now. The whole hate crime industry is aimed at shutting down debate and silencing different political viewpoints. And I just want to go back to something Bill was saying. Bill was saying we can't go and protest. Well, we can go and protest as long as it's kind of approved of by the you know. So Black Lives Matter protests were fine, but you know, you get arrested if you go for an anti-lockdown protest. I mean, these are, you know, these choices are being made in front of our eyes by the people in charge of our authorities, and largely fueled by the sorts of people who run the social media companies. You know, one set is approved of, one set is not approved of. And the problem with social media is so dominant of the market that there is, and all of them essentially have the same sort of philosophical point of view. There's no kind of there's no real alternatives in the market to go to. So once people get effectively blocked by it, then you are actually literally shutting people out. It's not like the newspapers, you know, if you're kind of leftish, you go towards the Guardian and can have a platform there. If you're right, you can go to the Telegraph or Express or somebody and have a platform there. But it's with social media, there is no alternative. And what's interesting about lockdown is that, you know, we were already very reliant on social media, but actually we've become far more reliant on it now, and it's really kind of put us into their hands, as it has with all online companies. You know, Amazon is another example, and so you know, it's becoming a real problem.
I think actually, Rebecca, you made a very interesting point there, that one of the most insidious aspects of it is the way it encourages subtly behavioural change. You know, I mean, I'm very careful what I say on Facebook and YouTube, because I know that most of what I would say would get me a strike on YouTube or get me, you know, probably removed from Facebook. And this is the thing. People then do start to adjust their behaviour. And that's a problem, because that means that people are being controlled actually in what they say, Rebecca, by the very platforms that they're on, which is, it's wrong, isn't it?
Oh, it's totally wrong. And, you know, you and I have personal experience of that on Twitter. But I have to say that one thing that's come out of all this for me is that I am now more reliant on print media than I ever was. And so, you know, and so I because I don't trust the mainstream media. And for me now, YouTube and Facebook by default have become mainstream media, because they will only allow mainstream views to go out there. They're really heavy on, really, they have an editorial line. And the only way they do it is, rather than positively advancing their editorial line like the BBC would, is that they just cancel you if you're not in the standard deviation of what they consider their editorial line to be. So I have now converted more to print media. And actually, that's a good thing. That has to be a good thing, because we were beginning to see newspapers falling apart because the other forms of readily available media were more popular. But I think proper journalism actually can only be found in print media now.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Obviously, I'd completely agree with that. Always tell people to buy a newspaper. It's
yeah. Well, I mean, look, the written word is a wonder, and this country, in fact, you know, if you look at, especially in England, back to all the great writers over all the centuries, we've got a proud tradition of the written word. We've got a proud, actually, tradition, David, of robust journalism. You know, and that, which I think actually, funny enough, Rebecca, you might agree, perhaps that contrasts with, say, France, for example. I'm not sure that French journalism is just quite as likely to poke, you know, the finger in the direction of the elite, perhaps, as some do here, as some do in the UK.
It's interesting, because it's the smaller regional newspapers seem to be the ones that really do advance and advocate the alternative causes, and they're the ones that have editorials on, you know, say, an anti-establishment viewpoint. They very much cater to their local environment, but the local environment is significantly larger than, say, in Britain. And so I'm a big supporter of the local press in France, and I do regularly read La Dépêche for our region. Le Monde, I could just translate that into English and I'd be reading the Washington Post, quite frankly.
Yeah. I mean, I think actually, Bill, the thing about the sort of the print media as such, we've sort of stumbled onto this one, but we're finishing this. But you know, the print media has been put to the sword, let's be honest, by social media in a significant way. And In fact, there's a group that I'm familiar with. David Maddox might be aware of them as well. A group called JPI. Not sure if you're familiar with JPI.
Oh, no, they're my former employers.
Yeah, well, you know them then. Yeah. So JPI,
disastrous company.
disastrous. 2005, the JPI went on an Scottish business, I think originally anyway. They went on an acquisition trail, bought themselves about 860 million, round about that, worth of assets in terms of print, and they were sold to someone I know the other day for 10 million. Not bad. 850, I think, David, down to 10 million. And I don't know how they're going to make money from it.
That's not just, sorry, Bill, I know you're asking a question, that's not just talking from very bitter experience on this. And as somebody who started on the local weekly newspaper, went on to one of those Johnson Press newspapers in Portsmouth, which at the time had over 100,000 daily circulation when I arrived there. And, we won awards when I was there. It was terrible mismanagement, terrible mismanagement. And that, more than the BBC or social media or other alternative platforms, more than anything, has undermined local press in this country to a depressing level. I can't think of these days when a young would-be journalist asks me for advice. I can't say to them, well, start with your local paper or go to a regional, cut your teeth, which is a great way of doing things, by the way, but because it's all gone. And, my first experience of covering politics was covering local councils, which could be pretty ferocious places to cover, actually, and great news sources and things. The kind of local council reporter barely exists anymore, and that is really a big problem for local democracy in this country, because councils, mayors, police commissioners, all these people hold huge amounts of power, and there is nobody now really asking the difficult questions for those areas, and it's a real problem.
I mean, that's a very good point, Bill, isn't it? If you're going to hold, these local politicians and others to task, what better way to do that through local journalism? But as David points out, it's gone through a very, very tough time, hasn't it?
Yeah, our local newspaper in my area, the Express and Star, still sends journalists to council meetings, and the council meetings actually used to make front page headlines when we were in there as UKIP councillors, because they almost always ended up in some kind of face-off and battle, because it was 6 or 7 UKIP councillors against a combined 65 Tories and Labour shouting abuse at us. But I want to give a very topical, salutary tale about the printed press, though, and this has happened only in the last 24 hours. I was the person who unearthed this story that's been going round about the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner advertising for an assistant director of belonging and feeling nice or something like that. I found that story out, tweeted it out and copied in the local newspaper. The local newspaper included me on the online version with my quote, but the printed version, it didn't. Now it's gone to the Daily Mail, and on the Daily Mail's online version, it's all local Conservatives commenting on it, and there isn't a single mention of the person who unearthed it. So, you've got to sometimes be a little bit aware that, I'm all for freedom of the press and things like that, but there are editorial decisions that go on, and it's not quite so fitting to the line of some of these newspapers to have a guy who's a former UKIP MEP speaking about it as to have the Conservative candidate for Police and Crime Commissioner mentioning it. So, there are, and these guys would never have heard of it if I hadn't just been a nosy bugger looking through the trolling round trying to find something that I could cause some trouble about.
Are you going to apply, Bill?
Pardon?
Are you going to apply for it? I think it looked like a peachy little number. I quite fancy that job.
I'm holding out for diversity manager. I think that's more my scene.
Okay, all right. Well, look, that's an interesting conversation. Okay, folks. So anyway, predictably, new year, new lockdown, and as we can't avoid it because this is the dominant, political story of the Well, for eternity, it seems to me. But Rebecca, I want to start off with you. Here's the question. If lockdowns work, why do we keep having them? And if they don't work, why do we have them at all?
Well, the current lockdown is required because we've got a problem with our hospital capacity. And that's what this is all about. It's very emotive to talk about deaths. And it doesn't really hit the real problem in the system, which is the ability of our hospitals to cope. One of the added complications at the moment in the hospital is that they are trying to do a catch-up on all of the elective surgery, say for cancer operations, that they missed out on March to May. So lockdowns do work in that they reduce the hospital admission numbers. And that was demonstrated in the March to May lockdown. It was also demonstrated really well in the November lockdown. So they do work. They do work for reducing the burden on the NHS. So I would challenge your opening position that they don't work, because they do work.
Well, it was a question, Rebecca. It wasn't a position. It was a question. David Maddox, turning to you. Sunday, the other day, Boris went on the Andrew Marr show, I think, on BBC One, and he told parents to send their kids to school on Monday, insisting that's the best place for kids to be. 24 hours later, he was telling those same parents that the schools were being closed and the kids are staying at home until, who knows, mid-February, maybe even longer, depends who you listen to. Let me ask you this, David. What sort of political damage do you think things like that cause to Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party?
I would say at this stage, probably not a lot, because we've now got so used to him making these sudden U-turns, over 24 hours. And there have been so many of them, but it does just add to a picture of complete incompetence, I'm afraid. And it makes it very difficult for his supporters to say that he's handling this crisis well. Personally, I think he should have just stuck with his original gut instinct, which was the best place for kids is in school. And actually, I mean, I've written about this on a number of things, but I mean, the close of the schools is in the end going to do far more damage to kids than keeping them open. They're certainly not in any danger of dying from this disease or even being seriously ill from it. So it's and you have to wonder. I mean, we've spoken to scientists, some of whom advise the government, most of whom don't agree with the current kind of path the government's taking, which is, they don't think lockdowns work. All it does is it pushes the problem further down the line, and you get an explosion after. And the best example of that was when the Welsh did their 2.5-week lockdown, and of course there were virtually no cases during that time, and there was a complete explosion as soon as they lifted it. It just, it's there's an awful lot of questions to be asked about the science, which aren't being asked. The 70% extra infection of this mutant variant is far from proven. There's a lot of question marks about that, and yet it is rolled out as a statement of fact. And I think in the shake-up of these things, when people look back at the damage that's been done with a lot of the lockdown measures and the actual veracity of some of the claims that should be made to justify them, then there's going to be some serious questions to be asked, not least about the future of these poor kids.
Well, actually, David, just on that, and moving to you, Bill. We're told that, and Rebecca's sort of said this as well, that we've got a lockdown to protect the NHS and health capacity and all that there. So we hear that clear argument. Bill, do you wonder if the government is interested in saving the economy as well and the millions of jobs, especially of low-paid workers, or is it just to be the NHS above and beyond everything else? What do you think?
Well, this is the issue with everything else that I'm absolutely incensed about. I can't begin to explain to you, David, how angry I am about what's going on with these lockdowns. One, yeah, the NHS being put up on this high pedestal. You know, everyone supposed to be cheering it every Thursday and all the rest of it. And the whole of life being run around protecting the blessed NHS. Well, hang on a minute, with no economy and lower tax revenue, a hugely bloated NHS will not be able to feed so much on our taxpayer money. That's one thing. The other thing is that there are a huge amount of potential issues whereby infections are happening within the NHS. So you go in for one thing and you happen to catch COVID inside the hospital itself. Also, as we've mentioned the lady's name earlier, Julia Hartley-Brewer, on her show today, it was clear that a lot of the figures, this was a person with the nursing profession she interviewed, a lot of the figures down as COVID being in hospital were actually in for something completely different, and they got it in hospital, or they happened to be tested for COVID, and COVID was nothing to do with the reason they were in hospital. Add on to that the fact that we already had a mental health emergency crisis in this country, which had been building up for years. And now, after a year of house arrest, stealing people's liberty, freedom, in many cases their futures, that is only going to snowball to huge proportions, shutting down gyms, stopping people playing sport, again, physical and mental issues attached to it, and most of all, above everything, the catastrophic effect on our fiscal situation of over £1 trillion thrown away on billions spent on testing. If the NHS was short of the ability and capacity to deal with this, it would have been cheaper to increase that capacity. We're also short on capacity because nurses and doctors are having to isolate because of this ludicrous track and trace situation, where if they're exposed, they have to have time out of work. So there are people off the wards. The whole thing is an absolute catastrophe, and we will be suffering from this for decades to come. Decades.
Just on what Bill was saying about the mental health crisis, my excellent colleague Lucy Johnson, who does our health coverage, has been talking to some of the suicide-related charities, and the number of suicides. And this is not been widely reported, but we've certainly run based on it. The number of suicides go up 25% when lockdowns happen, which is a hell of a collateral damage, really, for supposedly protecting lives, protecting the NHS. Another thing I wrote about this in early December after my mother's funeral. My mother died of cancer, which went undetected during the first lockdown, and it was eventually found too late. There are 50,000 cases like that in Britain. And that was the figure up to November. So, goodness knows what that continues. So just even on the health outcomes, this policy is failing, and it has a lot of question marks around it.
But you can't put a cancer patient into an environment where there is a virus that causes such lethality. And this is the problem. A cancer patient cannot go into hospital where there is a risk, which we know 30%.
No, but they're not even detecting the cancer.
Yes, I know.
Once mom's cancer got detected, she was in hospital. They put her in hospital and she had the treatment, but it was too late. The problem is they're not detecting it.
I know, but the reason we're not detecting it, kind of going back to what Bill was talking about, and I don't disagree with anything that anybody said, is that this is really, I think it's boiled down to a question, is it lives or livelihood? Because we know that saving lives in the short term is sometimes a really acute decision. And that can be anything from, do you need oxygen right now because you've got the respiratory symptoms of this disease? That is an immediate problem. And that patient will always elbow out the one who doesn't need oxygen, but maybe needs their cancer surgery tomorrow. But that one is delayable. But that's the lives side of the argument. The other side, which Bill has sort of characterized, is the livelihood. And out of livelihood argument, you do end up with questions of suicide, long-term cancer survival, and the fact, as Mervyn King said, that recessions do cause accelerated death rate. We know all that. We know that the poorest people suffer more. We know that by shutting schools, the poorest children suffer more. We know all that, but what do you do when you have an acute problem of people queuing up for oxygen? It really is such a horrible decision to make. And I know, speaking to, a member of my family who's a consultant in charge of the ITU at Southampton General Hospital, they are now sending patients up to Sheffield. So interestingly, he is transferring patients to my daughter in Sheffield on the ICU there because we have run out of beds. It really, truly is a disaster, what is happening in medicine. We haven't got to the point where we're having to make a decision about who to ventilate or who to put onto the ICU, but we could well end up there if this current spike isn't suppressed.
Rebecca, wouldn't it have been better to have spent some of this money that Sunak has thrown out into the economy, this £1 trillion plus? Surely, rather than wasting it on testing, for example, which is out of date as soon as you walk out the testing centre, why not build and expand NHS capacity and take on more people? Why are the Nightingale hospitals not being used? I accept what you're saying entirely as someone with experience in the hospitals, and you know more about that than me, and I'm not disputing it. But surely this money has been burnt. It's been thrown away on useless things, when all we needed to do, in many cases, was to expand hospital facilities, and we've had months to prepare for this. Months.
Yeah, but Bill, I mean, I'm talking about myself. I was a senior sister in an acute setting. So I did acute renal dialysis within the ICU. So I was like a super specialist within the ICU setting. It took 4.5 years to train me. And by the time I was a sister in the unit, I had been 6.5, 7 years down the line. You don't suddenly train ICU nurses. And, we do have a surge capacity with an ICU, which is about 15%. But a coronavirus patient, by virtue of the level of infectiousness of the virus, means that our effective bed capacity is reduced quite significantly by as much as 15% across hospitals because of the social distancing, the fact that nurses are wearing PPE when we never normally have to. In a flu epidemic, we don't wear PPE. We just go in our normal uniforms. All of those builds in problems with bed availability. An ICU bed is not simply a bed. An ICU bed is about 15 specialties. And actually, you cannot off-site the massive infrastructure for an intensive situation. I'm not just talking about manually ventilated beds either. I'm talking about patients who end up on CPAP. If you're over 50 and you're admitted for coronavirus because you need oxygen, you have a 15% chance of needing CPAP. Now, if you're on CPAP, you are desperately unwell. You don't have a ventilator tube down your throat, but you are on a CPAP system. You can't off-site those patients. It's too risky.
What's the point of the Nightingales then?
So the Nightingales actually was, when they first set the Nightingales up, they were dealing with the data from Italy. And, if you have to put things back into their context, when they were calling for 30,000 extra ventilators, very quickly, the British Association of Anaesthetists worked out that actually this wasn't a ventilation issue with these patients, it was actually an inflammatory disease, and that they were going to do better with CPAP. So they actually downgraded the need for the ventilators in the Nightingale hospitals really, really quickly. So what we should do, and in fact they are using the Nightingale hospitals at the moment, not for coronavirus patients, but they are using them for regular screening, but they haven't got infrastructure, they haven't got x-ray machines, they haven't got scanners, they haven't got technicians, they haven't got laboratories. They were really meant almost as palliative care for people to die in. Now, we're not at that point yet, but even if we were, we simply do not have the people with the skills and the infrastructure. It's not just the nurses. You need registrars there. You need, or the odd consultant on call. You need pathologists, you need the x-ray technicians, you need the ventilator technicians, you need the physiotherapists. It is not simply one nurse per bed. It is so much more than that. Actually, you could say, well, we could have surged our capacity back in March. Yeah, we could have done, but you would then have a health service that twiddles its thumbs for the rest of its existence. So it has to be a short-term resolution of this coronavirus.
Yeah, but Rebecca, the point is that there are some unusual cruelties that are happening in the NHS at the moment. I was made aware of a situation this morning where a young couple had their first child, their first baby, and the baby sadly was born with a brain tumor. And because of current circumstances, the dad wasn't allowed in during the birth. He couldn't get in, so his wife basically managed on her own. Then, when they discovered within a day or so of that the tumor was actually going to be terminal, the child was going to die, he was allowed in to say goodbye to his 1 or 2 year old child. Now, I'm sorry, but from where I sit, that's unusually cruel. I just can't get my mind around that. And, David Maddox mentioned, what happened to his mum as well. And the problem is there's so many stories like this. These stories are legion. In fact, I'm more familiar with stories like David's and the one I've just mentioned than I am with people having died of COVID-19, which is strange. I mean, I don't deny it, but it's just, I hear stories more about the cruelty of the NHS and the abysmal failure of the NHS than the triumphant savings of lives from COVID. Bill, what's your thoughts?
Look, I take on board a lot of what Rebecca said, I'm not going to say that anyone working in the NHS is, having a laugh at this time, but there are so many other things. You've mentioned the instances of cruelty. There are people who are not getting in for treatments. And what's more, also, you can't get into a GP surgery. It's like getting into Fort Knox trying to get into a GP surgery because they've locked themselves down because they act as if everyone walking around is carrying the Black Death. And what's, the final thing I really want to emphasize about this, we've got coming down the line, Rebecca said about the NHS being left twiddling its thumbs afterwards. Well, it won't be, because we've got a huge crisis, as I said before, mental health, huge issue, and on top of that, poverty kills. Poverty is the biggest killer. And by trashing our economy the way we have done this year, you're going to see millions plunged into economy, poor diets, poor lifestyle. I've represented and come from an area of high poverty already. Believe you me, guys, these people are going to be thrust into poverty, the likes of which many people would not understand. And that's going to create far greater demand in the long run than anything we've seen as yet. And that's why I get so passionate about this. Not because people like Rebecca are wrong or cruel in any way, what they say. I can understand what she's saying. But I really feel and believe that in the next 10 years, we're going to see the result of what's happened in this last year. And it's going to be an absolute bloody catastrophe. And Boris Johnson and Hancock and co. will have to be held responsible for what's happening to millions of people as a result of their actions.
I agree, but the thing is that when you're presented with a patient in hospital, it's not a 10-year question. It's not the livelihood question. It's the 10-minute question. That person needs high volume oxygen now. So, you know, I think maybe the discussion we have to remove it from the NHS, because I don't think anybody thinks the NHS is doing a bad job. There are individual stories which are tragic, and, you know, really, I can't comment about those, obviously, but they're hard to hear. I have written articles about the crisis in breast cancer screening, and we are storing up problems for the future. So I think
that's right.
We need to move the discussion from the health service. And I've always been a very strong critic of the way the NHS is run, because I've always believed that it is a human resources department above and beyond everything else. And it would work extremely well if it never catered for a patient, because the minute you need to look after patients, the NHS actually isn't that good. So I think it's a behemoth of bureaucracy. Even getting back to work, for me, I need to have done a radicalization program. I mean, frankly, I don't care if the person standing in the line is a bloody jihadi or not. If he's getting the jab, I'll give it a bit harder if I think he's a jihadi. They've made it difficult to recruit back people like me because they are a bureaucratic nightmare. So the question has got to be, how many more things do we need to be putting into the balance when we look at lockdowns? We have to make compromises. We know we have to make compromises because the virus transmits by human to human contact, and schools have got to be the last things to shut, in my opinion. But in order to say that, you have to accept all of the assumptions that go above that, that lockdown is justified, that you do believe the tests, the PCR tests, that you do believe ICUs are full. And I don't think the government is doing the right job on messaging. It's the messaging they're getting wrong.
Well, one of the messages, David, if we can just turn to you, following on from what Rebecca's just said, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has promised, I see he's promised further billions today to keep
money,
to keep companies in existence that would otherwise, you know, go out, would vanish. Now, does it matter that a Conservative government is spending like Corbyn on steroids?
Well, I mean, given that they've basically accepted Rebecca's logic of the case, and that's government policy, then yes, they have no choice. They have a moral duty to support these businesses in these extreme circumstances. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But the money will run out eventually, and if it doesn't, we're going to be paying it off for years and years and years. You know, it's going to be like the Napoleonic War debt. We'll, you know, about 5 generations' time, they'll have an announcement that it's finally been paid off, or something. You know, but I just want to get back to the point Bill was making. Really, I think it's wrong to characterise this as lives against livelihoods. I'm sorry, Rebecca. It is not lives against livelihoods. It's lives against lives. It's lives now against lives in the future. It's lives who have one condition against lives who have another condition. This is the problem. Bill rightly says poverty kills. And when people lose their jobs, they're more likely to commit suicide. If people's marriage breaks up or their partnerships break up because of losing their jobs or their economic circumstances, then, you know, they're more likely to commit suicide. When people are poor, they're more likely to die. And these are the harsh realities of life. And yes, you can look at it in the short term and say, have we got enough oxygen facilities and so forth? And I know it's very, very hard choices to make. But this is, of course, why we elect politicians to make these choices. But, you know, when you're making these choices, when you're making the choice to lock down, and, you know, Whitty was talking about locking down again in December. Again, I mean, this is madness. You know, after all the vulnerable groups have had the jab, supposedly. You know, I mean, it's completely crazy. You know, these are you're making choices about some lives over other lives, and that, I'm afraid, you know, it has to be. It's easier to deal with the short term, but actually, the greater damage is going to be in the long term, and I'm completely with Bill on this one.
But David, that's a daily calculation that the NHS makes even in normal time, is
Indeed,
that you can't save everybody, and you know that is the very nature of triage. And what you're seeing now is triage. They are triaging people who need oxygen, and it's sort of, you know, is it later? If somebody's sitting in an ambulance and needs oxygen, they need oxygen. You know, and if you've got somebody who's waiting for a bed on ICU because they've got an esophageal tumor that needs resecting, that ICU bed can be taken up by the patient sitting in the ambulance, because the esophageal resectomy patient is going to be walking in tomorrow or next week. It's always adjourning the less critical patients. And this is the problem. What I think is the issue, though, is that you can punish the populace. You can keep telling them they're doing the wrong thing, but that is not going to solve the essential problem. I really don't think it is going to solve the problem. And, you know, to have our politicians looking us in the eyes and saying it's all your fault, you shouldn't have done it, and, you know, it's because of Christmas. That is the wrong narrative to go down. People have to grow up about the very, very real risk of dying from either COVID or the effects of COVID. But the effects of COVID death, as you and Bill have very adequately explained, is a very broad church. And the effects from COVID death could be 10 years down the line, because poverty kills by reduced life expectancy. You're more likely to die from dementia or cerebrovascular or cardiovascular disease because you are poor. You're not more, you know, suicide is an instantly obvious one, but actually it's long-term health risks that come from poverty. So that is adjourning that person's reduced life expectancy in favor of the one who's sitting in an ambulance outside Southampton General Hospital right now because there is no ICU bed. And who wants to make that decision? It's an awful decision to have to make.
And yet, every year we have the same problems with beds and things. I mean, you know, there's certainly you know, whether it's, you know, I mean, a bad year, 20,000 people will die of flu.
Yeah,
you know, in a winter crisis.
That's right. Nurses don't have to wear PPE. You actually increase your beds in a flu season. You don't nurse your flu patients in isolation from the other ward patients, because the R value of flu is considerably lower than the R value of coronavirus.
And yet what they've done is working. 1 in 4 people who get coronavirus get it in hospital.
Yes, but again, you know, so Bill was criticizing GPs for being shut. It's precisely that reason why GPs are shut, is because they can transmit the virus to patients. And this is what's happening in hospitals, is nurses are being redeployed from one side of the hospital to the other, or an X-ray machine is going from one side of the hospital to the other, and on it, it's carrying the coronavirus. A lot of the transmission is through the staff, which is why staff need to be vaccinated really, really quickly to stop this transmission across the hospital. So even though hospitals now are divided into green, yellow, and red zones, that reduces bed occupancy by virtue of doing that. We never have to do this in influenza seasons, because influenza is infectious.
Is there a TikTok zone in the hospitals? The reason I ask is, I'm sure everyone on this stream has seen video footage of hospitals, NHS hospitals, where there's large empty areas. Now, I appreciate that these are for outpatients.
Oh, thank God he's gone.
We'll have a chat amongst ourselves now. I'll step in. Rebecca, I think he was going to ask you about people making TikTok videos, and now you can give your big defence.
Yes, well, of course, I mean, I criticised them at the time as well. There is no defence, but what the NHS... But David, we've taken over. We know what you were going to say.
Sorry about
that. I channeled you, David. I channeled you.
I accidentally wiped myself off the stream. Sorry about that. But over to you, folks.
Yeah, so of course, nobody likes to see them. Who knows where they were coming from? Really not on, and I criticised them very much at the time. The issue was that they discharged 35,000 patients weekend of the 23rd of March, and that was a diktat from Sir Simon Stevens. In doing so, as we now know, they discharged a lot of coronavirus positive patients back into the care sector, and then they died. And they were not allowed actually to go back into hospital either. That's a whole other argument. But yes, there were very empty areas of the ward. At the time, my daughter was working on the orthopedic wards, and she was going in for an hour because they just cancelled everything electively because they were expecting this massive surge, which never happened. So they cleared the decks, cleared all elective surgery, cleared all screening procedures, because they knew then that the R value of coronavirus was 3, and they knew that they would be seeding the infection on otherwise healthy people. So the provenance of the videos, you know, they were reprehensible, and nobody can defend them. Friends of mine who are very senior nurses now, they were saying, if any of my staff do that, they're going to get sacked. We're just not doing that. But I accept, you know, the NHS did get it wrong at the start. It did discharge the coronavirus into the community and was responsible probably for that 30,000 all-cause mortality in the community. Yeah. And I have no doubt that that 30,000 comes from those community sufferers of coronavirus. And you know, the tragedy was for them was that they were being discharged to the care sector. The care sector isn't staffed by people like me who know how to operate drips and oxygen. It's staffed by people who are just nice people who want to look after elderly people. They don't understand palliative care. They don't have actually the ability to deliver morphine or any end-of-life palliative medicine. So those people were actually dying pretty ghastly deaths in the care sector, and doctors weren't going out to them. It was a terrible tragedy.
No, I think it was criminal, but I mean, be that as it may, Bill, I wanted to turn to you. What is your confidence? Can I ask you, because I have to keep an eye on the screen. What is your confidence that having gotten us into 3 lockdowns, Boris will get us out of this one, and we won't have to go back into a 4th lockdown?
0. Absolutely 0. Well, because even on the briefings that they give, and he has his mad scientist henchmen by the side of him, and they're asked questions about, what's going to happen, once we've had the jabs. Oh, no, you can still pass it on. You can still get ill from it. It's only going to make you slightly less ill. So we're having this huge vaccination program that's going to take months. And he says that's with a fair wind. And we all know government procurement programs and government rollouts always overrun. So it's going to take months and months. And then all these new variants and frightening mutant viruses we keep being told about, it's not going to work the way they want. They're going to panic again, lock us down again. And you know what? People are going to start to go one of 2 ways. They're either going to just give up and allow themselves to just be dominated by this police will resist. And when they start to resist, if they do, that's very, very dangerous for society as a whole.
David, if I could turn to you next. A lot of people, David, are putting hope into vaccines. We've got the Pfizer vaccine approved. We've got the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. There may be others coming, and so on and so forth. So if these work, here's my question. If these vaccines will work and do what the manufacturers claim, why isn't the government saying life will then get back to normal after the vaccines? Because the government's not saying things will revert back to normal. Why might
Well,
that?
we had two messages today, didn't we? One from Boris and one from Chris Whitty.
Yeah.
And the message from Boris was very much, well, you know, most of the vulnerable people can be vaccinated by mid-February, and we can see restrictions with fair wind. We can see restrictions being lifted early March in time for spring. But then Chris Whitty was saying, well, yeah, but you know, we might need restrictions in the winter again, and there's a clear divergence of opinion there. There's, to me, I mean, what we need to do is understand what this vaccine actually does. The vaccine reduces, both the vaccines reduces the chance of you dying or suffering seriously from coronavirus. There's no evidence yet that it reduces transmission or even prevents transmission. There's no evidence on that at all. And it doesn't stop you from getting it. So there's arguments knocking around. Teachers should have it. You know, maybe some teachers should have it, but teachers in their 20s and 30s, there's less of a case for it, frankly. What you need, as Chris Whitty actually rightly said, is for people who are most likely to die from this disease to get the vaccine, so that the chances of dying are much reduced, if not completely reduced. And at that point, then there is no case for continuing restrictions. Once the vaccine has come into operation with the vulnerable people, there's no need to continue with restrictions. And at that point, we should be, March, April, if we carry on the pace that they claim that they can carry on vaccine, we should be looking at the restrictions being lifted and us returning to normality, frankly.
Rebecca, can I ask you, I mean, what's your thoughts? Do you reckon that by, April, May, do you think life in the UK for most people will be back to what we had? Or do you think we're actually moving into a very different future?
Well, I think it's a bell curve, and I think people have to take note. When COVID-0 is never going to happen, it's impossible. This virus is here to stay. Just like our winter influenza, we are, as a society, going to have to accept what the number of acceptable deaths is every year, the one that we normalize ourselves to. 20,000 deaths from influenza is not unheard of. It's normally within the sort of 10 to 15 range, but we do see big spikes occasionally. Coronavirus is going to have its own numbers, and there is going to come a time where people are going to normalize themselves to, say, 10,000 coronavirus deaths a year, because everything David has said is actually quite right. All that the vaccination does is reduces the burden of the disease. It makes you suffer from it less. It doesn't stop you catching it. It can't. That is impossible. No vaccination works that way. But the plan is, and the sort of the economic plan is, that we get coronavirus down to a level that is tolerable. And that means people are going to die every year from coronavirus, but people die every year from going out in their cars. So it is just a number that society can tolerate. I believe that vaccine is the way out. I see no other way out of this. And I see that 60 to 70% of the population is either going to have had coronavirus or be vaccinated. The two together are going to give us a suppression to the point where we may have 5,000 deaths a year. I'm just throwing that number out there. I don't know what it is, but there is going to be a number who die every year. And yeah, we will be out. We won't be out by next December, though, because this will add into a flu season. Which
then begs the final question, though. If what Rebecca said is right, how much of the UK economy is going to be left standing come January 2022?
Well, about as much as now, which is nothing. Let's be plainly honest. The economy has been devastated and wiped out, and everything they do now is just adding to the debt and the fiscal burden. And eventually, someone is going to somewhere twig, hang on a minute, this country is only existing because the Bank of England's magicking money up out of nowhere to pay government debt, which is totally against its charter, by the way, to do. Yeah. The economy has been ruined. Our fiscal situation has been ruined. I understand all of what Rebecca said about the medical situation, totally appreciate it. But if we don't do something about the economic and the fiscal situation, we're going to have far bigger worries on our plate because we are going to collapse as a country because you cannot exist without a functional economy. Just can't be done.
Yeah. Well, on that note of cheeriness, Bill, I'd like to thank you very much for being on the stream. Rebecca, saying thank you for being here. David, lovely to have you in the stream. Hope you'll come back. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Those of you who watch this in replay, make sure you drop your comments below, and we'll catch up with you very shortly for another interesting debate here on Open Dialogus. Thanks for being here. That's it from us for tonight. Good night.